Here's Courtney Gustafson, reading Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld.
Freshman fall. I think that everything, or at least the part of everything that happened to me, started with the Roman architecture mix-up. Ancient history was my first class of the day, occurring after morning chapel and roll call, which was not actually roll call but a series of announcements that took place in an enormous room with 20-foot-high Palladian windows, rows and rows of desks with hinged tops that you lifted to store your books inside, and mahogany panels on the walls, one for each class since ALT's founding in 1882, engraved with the name of every person who had graduated from the school.
Welcome to Pages Past, the podcast where we visit the Library of Memory. I'm Genna Buck. In each episode, I invite a guest to choose a book from their past to read and discuss. Through conversation and close reading, we'll find new meanings in our old favorite books. And today, my guest is Courtney Gustafson, the author of one of my favorite books that I have read this year, Poet Square, a Memoir in 30 Cats, which documents Courtney's life and journey in the lead up to becoming a caretaker of community cats in Tucson, Arizona, which she is today. She's also a creator. You may have seen some of her work on TikTok or Instagram under the name Poet Square Cats. If the names Sad Boy and Lola mean anything to you, I think you are really going to like this episode. Courtney, welcome to Pages Past.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm so excited to dig in with you. You have chosen Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld. This was such a treat for me. This is a writer that I love, but I hadn't read this book. And it's a novel, but written in the form of a memoir. And this gave me some painful teenage flashbacks. I'm guessing it also gave some of that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I first read the book as a teenager and at the time found myself really relating to and loving the protagonist. And this time was thinking, oh my God, I related to this protagonist? That's horrifying.
A little concerning. Yeah, we'll get into why. But I actually see, and we're going to talk about this, I see some seeds of where this work may have influenced your work. And I should say how excited I am to have a real life New York Times bestselling author. You are our first on this show. I can't wait to dig into this. But before we do that, we're going to flash back to the conversation that we had before you started rereading, where you tell us about your early memories with this book. So you have chosen the book Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld. How did you encounter this book?
I was given Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld for Christmas one year. I looked back at when it came out to try to figure out what year it was, and I think it would have been the year it came out, which would have made me maybe 14 or 15 when I read the book. My parents gave it to me for Christmas, and it was, age 14 is one of the last years that my parents were trying to cling to, maybe Santa is leaving us gifts under the tree. So we opened gifts under the tree, and I spent the rest of the morning reading that book, and I had finished it by the end of the day. Somewhere there's a picture of me on Christmas morning sitting by the tree, just completely absorbed in the book. And I distinctly remember my mom kind of, being a little disappointed that I was ignoring all of my other gifts because I had just opened a book and spent the rest of the day with it.
That's awesome. Do you remember what about it first attracted you? Why did you like it at that age, do you think?
I mean, I immediately remember the cover, and I'm sure it's had other iterations of a cover since then, but the paperback that I had was the belt across the front, and those were so popular at the time, and it just felt like such a trendy, bold cover. I just remember right away thinking, "Oh, I cannot wait to read this." I was so excited about it. And right off the bat, the protagonist is, I think, maybe 14. She's starting high school at the beginning of the book, and it very much centers around her going to school, her starting at a new school. And I mean, I will say at age 14, I was reading anything and, everything I could get my hands on. So probably any book would have absorbed me for the day.
Is there something from the content that you still think about today or that you remember?
I remember the book really teaching me a lot about class, about socioeconomic class in a way that I wasn't otherwise thinking about at that time in my life, or at least didn't have the language to think about correctly. It was very present in my life, but I think around that age, 14 or 15, I had been reading a lot of middle grade books and maybe a lot of books intended for younger audiences. And I remember Prep standing out as, being intended for young adults, but it felt very much like I was being spoken to as an adult. It addressed very adult topics. I remember being very scandalized at the time by some sex scenes in the book.
Yeah.
Things were just addressed so frankly in the book. I remember the protagonist starts at a very prestigious, expensive boarding school as a scholarship student, and that's kind of one of the main tensions of the book is that, she's kind of recognizing her own class as it differs from a lot of the kind of wealthy students around her. That was just so revelatory at the time for me, just how frankly everything was spoken about, but through the lens of this character who, for, in a lot of other ways was very similar to myself.
Right. So did you maybe gain a bit of class consciousness from this? Like, how were you thinking about class before and then thinking about it after the book? Were you just suddenly seeing things in your life through a class lens that you hadn't thought about before?
Yeah, definitely the class lens and like gaining some class consciousness for the first time. I think my family didn't have a ton of money growing up, but neither did really any of the families around me. And so I had some kind of basic understanding of, oh, my friend can afford these clothes and I can't, or, my family has a house, but my friend, is in a new apartment every year. Like there were, some basic differences you see around you, but had never had the life experience and had never had the education to kind of say, this is what it can actually look like in the real world. Some people have these vast differences in class that afford them access to different experiences and different connections. And the book just laid it out so, so bare. I remember, aside from the protagonist being a scholarship student and just having different life experiences and different family connections, I believe, if I remember incorrectly, there's a point where she dates someone who turns out to be staff at the school. And so she
Oh,
thinks she's finally like, okay, I got it. Like I'm going on dates, I'm succeeding. But it turns out to like it's really, really frowned upon. She's dating like a kitchen worker or something. And everyone is like, he's not one of us. And she's like, but he's the one I relate to most. And so there's this like real tension between like who's allowed to be at the school and who's allowed to have those experiences. And I think her parents from the Midwest come to visit her at some point, and there's just this really striking difference between the kids who have their really wealthy, well-connected parents come visit for Parents' Day and her parents who just kind of don't understand this like elite world she's part of now.
so interesting. I'm interested to see how the relationship reads now with sort of like adult eyes, because you said staff member, like an adult staff member, or it's like a teenage staff member. Do you remember?
I don't remember that being the scandalous part. It was very much just that like he was a local, he was like a townie working in the kitchen. And that's not the kind of person we socialize with here.
It'll be interesting to see how that reads now. Is there anything else, like looking toward reading it again, that you're excited to revisit or you think just might hit you differently with the passage of time?
I'm very excited to reread it. I remember it as almost a turning point in my life. It felt like I was reading a very adult book. I wish I had documented somewhere like what I read next, or, I wish I had a list of every book I had ever read in my life. But in my head, it was very much like I want to seek out more books like this. I want to read more about these big topics that I didn't even realize were topics. It made big topics very accessible for a 14-year-old who maybe is not otherwise reading like about socioeconomic class, right? And so I'm really interested as an adult who has now read many more adult books, if it still kind of holds up to that, like, wow, that's like a great young adult book.
I'd be interested to see if there's anything that doesn't hold up with modern eyes or with the passage of time. Is there anything that you think might not pass the 2025 sniff test?
I mean, I remember it definitely having some, well, I was going to say some pretty graphic sex scenes, but I was 14, so who knows how graphic those really were, right?
Yeah.
I remember the protagonist having her first sexual relationship with another student, probably what we would call today a situationship, right? He didn't really reciprocate feelings in the way that she did. And more of it is coming back to me now, actually, as I think about it. I think it involved a horrible rumor about her sexual skills at one point. And so I don't remember a lot about how all of that was kind of handled in the book. So I am curious, what might feel problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, your point about the employee that she dates, what his age was. I'm curious about that now too, because I
Yeah.
I don't remember that being an issue, but who knows? Maybe that was just not, didn't really flag as problematic to me at the time.
Can you just take us back to this moment. What was 14-year-old Courtney like, approximately 14? What was going on in your life at that time?
I was starting high school, and I probably would have just finished my first semester of high school if it was Christmas. Honestly, I think I was a lot like the protagonist in the book, who is smart and reads a lot and pretty academically minded, kind of awkward socially, maybe like every 14-year-old, like trying to find her place, trying to find her friends, and, all the kind of traditional navigating high school conflicts. I think probably that protagonist in the book probably made me realize some things about myself. So she was feeling kind of trapped or kind of stunted within her family and her public school that she was going to. And I think in a way that I could not have articulated at the time, I think I probably related to that and felt somewhat inspired by her. I know in the book it's her decision that she wants to go to this fancy boarding school, and she really has to petition her parents to let her go. And I think I felt somewhat inspired by her saying, like, there's bigger things for me out there. Like, I can make it at this big school. And then she gets to the school and is kind of floundering and kind of overwhelmed. And I think I was very much like the character in the book, who is kind of high achieving and has big goals, but then kind of floundering, especially socially, when I tried to reach them.
Before we go any further, let's drop this book into history and recap it for those who haven't read it or haven't read it in a while. Fair warning, this is your last chance to turn back. This podcast runs on spoilers. Prep, a coming-of-age novel by Curtis Sittenfeld, was published in 2005 to literary and popular acclaim. It tells the story of Lee Fiora, a working-class teenage girl from Indiana who lands a scholarship at a prestigious New England boarding school, ALT, where she attends around the late 80s and early 90s. Feeling out of place among wealthy students from elite families, Lee is very anxious, believes no one likes her, and isolates herself. Early in her freshman year, several dramas unfold between Lee and students even lower in the pecking order than herself. During a school day out, Lee faints at the mall ear-piercing store and is rescued by Cross Sugarman, a handsome, popular boy in her grade. She spends a whole day with him and his friends, but still believes they don't like her. Lee befriends the ultra-wealthy but socially awkward and eccentric Conchita and teaches her to ride a bike. Through her, Lee meets and bonds with another student, Martha. They decide to room together from second year on, dropping Conchita. Lee tries to get close to other students, but only in shallow, superficial ways. One is the school-wide game of Assassin, where you kill a fellow student by affixing a sticker to them. Lee wants to win and sees it as a way to get close to Cross, but she's defeated by a vengeful Conchita. In her second year, Lee carves out a niche cutting hair, sometimes for popular kids. They appreciate her skill, but treat her like staff. In her junior year, Lee's parents come for Parents' Weekend. She's rude to them and frets about how they don't fit in. Her parents take Lee and two friends out for dinner at a restaurant that isn't as nice as they're used to. And when Lee's dad refuses to drop off one of the friends at her boyfriend's hotel, an explosive fight ensues. He slaps Lee, and her parents go home early. That winter, Lee's first-year roommate, Sheen June, overdoses on pills. A teacher picks up Lee to visit her in hospital. Lee is awkward, but Sheen June's roommate, Clara, is utterly distraught. Lee later finds out that the two were in a sexual relationship. David, a member of the school's kitchen staff, drives Lee home from the hospital, and they hit it off and plan to go on a date. But when he approaches her in front of other students, she realizes how much of a social faux pas that would be, and blows him off. In the spring of junior year, Lee's roommate Martha wins the election for senior prefect, beating more popular girls. The same day, Lee, who had been struggling all semester with pre-calculus, chokes and collapses, unable to complete a take-home exam beyond the first question. Failure would guarantee Lee would not be asked back for senior year. Martha, without being asked, does the exam for her, risking her place at the school and her position as prefect. The narrator, Lee, speaking from the future, cuts in and reflects that the cutthroat social environment at Alt was the toughest place she ever had to fit in. She eventually learned to project confidence and win people over. She became, she says, likable. But Martha liked her before she was likable. During senior year, Cross wanders into Lee's dorm. They spontaneously make out, then continue to secretly hook up regularly. Lee convinces herself that she's in love, but is also extremely anxious and ashamed. She asks him to keep it a secret. Alt's principal chooses Lee to speak to a New York Times reporter for a story on prep schools. Lee, enticed by the attention and embellishing a bit, gives a full-throated critique of the school's classism, racism, and snobby culture. This sets off a huge scandal shortly before her graduation. Conchita gives a speech at school assembly, refuting Lee and insisting that the school is inclusive. Cross stops hanging out with Lee without explanation. She confronts him, and, in a very revealing conversation, he shows that he understands her quite well. He reminds her she was the one who wanted to keep their affair a secret. She made him admit that he would have never been with her publicly. He identifies that Lee has a hang-up about appearing weird to other people, and says both that she is not that weird, and that she needs to let go of the idea that being weird is bad. Senior trips and parties away from the school dramatically shift Lee's perspective, making her realize the world is much bigger outside of the boarding school bubble. The older narrator Lee, speaking from the future, catches the reader up on intervening events after more than 10 years have passed. All her classmates have become ordinary adults. Over time, she becomes a bit embarrassed to have attended such an elite school and downplays it. She looks back at her time at Alt with some sadness, saying, "I've never paid as close attention to my life, or anyone else's, as I did then." Let's catch up with Courtney, now that we have both read Prep. So, Courtney, you told me the story about doing that thing that we do when we're a kid. You don't have anything to do all day long, and you spend the whole day buried in a book, and this book just grabbed and held your attention. Did you have that experience with it this time? Did it grab you the same way?
It really did, and I think that was partly nostalgia. Rereading it felt like remembering a dream that I had kind of had in my head for a long time and finally had the chance to sit down with again and read all of those details. So it really did grip me. I also think it would have gripped me even if I was reading it for the first time now. It's a fairly accessible read that you can kind of fly through. The characters are so well done, but the plot also moves along pretty quickly. And admittedly, I read this time on an airplane. Don't do Wi-Fi or anything like that. So I had this book and a couple hours on a plane and nothing else to do. And it was really nice to kind of be fully absorbed by it the same way I was when I read it the first time.
What grabbed you this time, or maybe what would have grabbed you if this was your first time reading it?
Definitely a really different experience reading it this time. Like I said, I remember reading this as a teenager and identifying so much with our protagonist, Lee, and just thinking, like, this person gets it. This writer understands what it's like to be a 14 or 15-year-old girl. And reading it now as an adult, I think, oh my God, I probably should have been in therapy as a 14 or 15-year-old girl. And so it gripped me in more of a horrifying way, more of a, teenage flashbacks and thinking, oh my gosh, my poor past self who related to this so heavily. Really different experience reading it now in a pretty nightmarish way.
Yeah, I mean, you really feel for your younger self, right? Because I find it very relatable too. And then as I'm thinking that, I'm like, it's kind of troubling. Lee is a very complicated character because she's very brave. She takes this huge swing to get herself into a prestigious boarding school. There's nobody in her family pressuring her to do this. She has this chutzpah, but then she very quickly gets overwhelmed. And she feels very, very socially anxious, truly like an incredible overthinker, and feels like an outsider, and in meaningful ways is an outsider. We're going to talk a lot about belonging because she, in a lot of ways, like really doesn't belong. And I'm wondering if that's the part that you related to, or what part of her spoke to you.
My memory of the book and of Lee and the kind of general plot line was that she, in very real ways, didn't belong. My big takeaway, what I've remembered all of these years, is that it was really my introduction to thinking about class. And so I really remembered it as a book about Lee, who comes from a different part of the country, from a family in a lower socioeconomic class, going to this really elite boarding school and just feeling wildly out of place. And so all these years I had remembered it as like she's doing her best in this place where she truly doesn't belong. And what was really interesting to read now is that there were all of these times where she kind of had the opportunity to belong. She was invited to go to things and repeatedly said no. She had all of these opportunities to kind of participate, and she repeatedly kind of counted herself out from that. And that was the biggest difference in what I remembered of the book versus reading it now. It's almost like a horror movie where you're watching someone walk down the stairs and you're saying, "Don't go down the stairs." There's all these moments where you want to be like, "Lee, just go along." Like, she's wishing that she had friends and company at the same time that she's being invited to go out with people who could be her friends, and she doesn't see it that way. And so you kind of want to scream at her and be like, just go. You belong there. You can do it.
You're not as different as you think, and in a way you're kind of making yourself more different by not having shared experiences with other people.
Yeah, and there's these moments throughout where she gradually starts to realize she sees that someone else is struggling in the same way she does, and it feels like she still doesn't quite make that connection that maybe everyone is feeling similar ways.
Yeah, there's a very memorable part where she's sitting around like a cafeteria table and someone is trying to make plans for where people are going, and she gets to Lee and says, "Oh, I know you won't be going because you always say no." And she marks herself as not belonging. And I couldn't quite figure out where that came from, where the origin of that was, if that was something internal to her, or if that was something about the way that they were treating her, or something about her upbringing. I couldn't quite get a handle on it. It was just like a very anxious personality, like just socially awkward. Even though I couldn't figure it out, I really thought it was relatable.
Yeah, it felt like she went in with this core belief about herself that she didn't belong, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy very quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think you related to her in the same way now or a little differently? Are you more thinking back on your past self and how your past self related to her rather than relating to her now in your current Courtney-ness?
Definitely past self. And I mean, I saw my 14-year-old self in her very, very much. And I also saw a lot of my grad school self in her. And I write about that in my book Poet Square in an essay called Bubbles. And one of the big conclusions I come to in that essay is that belonging is an active process. It's something that we work on. It's not something we step into fully formed. I went into grad school much the same way, kind of with this basic insecurity or this basic core belief that I just wasn't as cool as everyone else, and I didn't have the same kind of like friend making capacities that everyone else has. Yeah, I saw a lot of Lee's interactions in how I was at that point in my life, and am very glad now to have learned a lot of the lessons that I have. I don't find myself relating to Lee in my current life now, and I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, that's great. I hope that even those of us who may continue being overthinkers and may continue being anxious as adults don't have that level of acute anxiety that you experience as a teenager because you have no perspective, no life experience. Right. Yeah. Everything is the most horrible thing that's ever happened. I can think of a few things that I see in this book and then I also see in your book, but I'm wondering if there's any that you thought of or you noticed that had any commonalities or harmonies between either the way this is written, like it may have actually inspired you as an artist, or something about the content that has some commonality with what you have written about.
I do think it's interesting that you describe Prep as a novel, but written as if it's a memoir. I had forgotten, one of the many things I had forgotten in the time since I originally read this over 20 years ago, was those kind of flashbacks at the end when she is, Lee as the narrator is writing as if, now we're past all of this and, kind of jumping forward and talking about where all of those classmates ended up and who she reconnected with. I had forgotten all of that. I didn't read a lot of nonfiction or memoir as a kid or as a teenager. It was probably not until college that I got into memoir and essays as a genre. And now it's my favorite. It's what I ended up writing for my first book and what I see myself writing more of in the future. So it's interesting to see that a book that gripped me so much and has remained in my head for 20 years since, was not a memoir, but definitely borrowed some ideas and some facets from memoir as a genre. The idea of belonging is so, so central to prep. And I don't think that belonging was a theme that I was thinking of consciously when I wrote Poet Square, or at least most of the essays in Poet Square. But it does very, very much end up being a central theme of the book.
Yeah, there's one particular part where I see kind of the same thing happening in your book and also in Prep, which is the character. In your case, it's your real life. In Prep, it's the character of Lee. Having this experience of kind of displacing the blame for something bad happening to you onto yourself. There's this passage in Prep where Lee says, I knew myself to be generous with encouragement only when I either did not want the thing the other person sought or did not believe the person would really get it. It was the opposite of what I aspired to. In the moment of truth, I wanted to be loyal and forthright, reliable, humble, trustworthy. Instead, I was greedy and envious. And then you write in Poet Square, forgive me for making you listen to your own writing, because when this happens to me, I want to launch myself into the sun, but I'm going to put you through it. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't capable of being good in the way that other people were. It was baffling to me how easily a coworker could offer me the last cookie at lunchtime without feeling like she had to keep it for herself. Sometimes I would collect Post-it notes and water bottles and bowls from the break room, any snacks that were left out, and hide them in my desk. I'd lie if anyone asked if I had them. I told myself that was just my personality. A little selfish, a little prone to bending the truth. I see in both of these, you're turning red. I'm putting you on the spot. My bad. I see in both of these the characterization of a very normal desire as selfish. Do you think I'm onto something here, putting these passages together?
That's a really interesting parallel, and that's like the same passage, the way you pulled those out. And I did not make that connection reading that passage in Prep. I did not even think of my own writing or my own experience in that. So it's really interesting to hear them side by side. I do think that there are things in Prep, there are these echoes of teenage anxiety that maybe are still universal for some people. I'm glad not to be a 14-year-old with anxiety anymore, but I still have anxiety in a lot of the basic ways that a lot of humans do. It is interesting to see the ways that some of those kind of core beliefs or core anxieties about being a human and being a good human can still echo up through our thoughts and through our writing. I will say, the essay that passage is from in my own book, Poet Square, is an essay called Hunger. And one of the main kind of conclusions in that essay, or explorations at least, is about who we all could be if we had all of the resources that we need, if we didn't have to worry about squirreling away enough food so that we wouldn't be hungry if we ran out of, money. Who we could be if we never had to think about having stable housing or having debt. If all of those things were taken care of, what would our personalities be like, and how does that change us? Although that's still an anxiety that surfaces sometimes, right? Am I doing enough good in the world? Am I good at my core? And is that the right question to ask? And how do we balance all of that? I think that's an anxiety that a lot of people have. But I will say that one of the big lessons that I've learned in my work, and that I think I come to in Poet Square, is that resources are a big part of that, what we have or what we don't have. That needing things or feeling like you need to squirrel things away is not necessarily selfishness, but is a reflection of maybe what you have or what resources you've had in the rest of your life.
In both, it's an unmet need.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you truly cannot flourish and thrive and flower into your full self if you have these unmet needs. And Lee has that. She has an unmet need for connection and love and friendship and belonging. And you're talking about having an unmet need for just material security.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you also tell these beautiful stories of cats becoming their full cat selves when they have their needs met, right? When they're no longer in pain, they're no longer having untreated injuries, they're no longer having a whole bunch of kittens they don't want or need to have, and have adequate food, and suddenly their little personalities come out. And that is one of my favorite parts of the book. I love reading about that.
Thank you.
What a gratifying thing to be able to do, to be able to facilitate.
Yeah, it's absolutely the best part. And getting to see the parallels with people was so eye-opening for me. And I mean, I think even if we think of Lee in prep, I think we see she talks every now and then about who she was at her old school, in her old hometown. She talks about how at Alt, at her boarding school, she won't even eat spaghetti in front of other people because she's so self-conscious. And yet in her hometown, she would do these pie eating contests. She was, always the one who was speaking out in class and participating. And it's like she got a whole new personality or lost her personality when she came to this boarding school because suddenly she's in such a different context, and that connection is so missing for her that it really affects every facet of her life.
Yeah, she isn't her full self with this security missing, right? She doesn't have that security of family and knowing who she is and knowing that she belongs. And suddenly a sort of darker aspect of her personality becomes revealed. It's sad, but it's also complicated because she's very privileged at the same time.
Yeah, and she says at one point that her family won't understand, but that the self she is at her boarding school is her real self now.
Yeah.
And I think that's so interesting because it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel like that's her full personality or who she's supposed to be or like she's got everything figured out there. But I think it's easy for that to become a belief about yourself. The same way that for me, I was like, I'm just selfish.
Yeah.
Sometimes I lie. That's just who I am. When in reality, that's not what's actually happening.
Yeah. And we see that it changes again because she says at the end when she's reflecting back as an adult that she doesn't like telling people that she ever went there and that she skates over it and she doesn't want it to become part of her adult identity. So it isn't fixed. I'm sure it felt really real at the time, but it's at a moment in time and it is going to change again.
Yeah.
You told me in our first conversation that you were at that age when you first read it a little shocked in the way that teens are by kind of the adult content of the book. And having read it, I think that makes perfect sense. It's really not a YA book. It's not intended for kids.
No, that was the biggest shock to me rereading this because for 20 years, I thought this was a young adult book. I read it at 14. I mean, it's about high schoolers.
Mm-hmm.
Even the cover, the kind of iconic paperback cover that I'm holding now has that pink and green belt. I don't know if that seems dated for someone picking that up now, but that exact belt was all the rage at the time. I think I owned that exact belt. And so it very much felt like a book for me at 14. And I have spent the last 20 years thinking, what a great YA book that really addressed hard-hitting adult topics. And so what a shock to reread it now and think, oh my God, this was meant for adults the whole time. I remember the things that were very scandalous to me at the time. Of course, now I'm 35 and none of that feels particularly scandalous as a 35-year-old, but I can definitely still read it through my 14-year-old eyes. And, some of the sexual content, I remember thinking like, oh my God,
yeah,
very scandalous as a young teenager who was also, fairly sheltered in my life. But it also meant that it addressed pretty head-on topics about money and class and privilege and race and mental health and belonging that I think was really important for me to read at that age. And so I'm grateful it ended up in my hands, even if parts of it were a little more than I was expecting as a teenager.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. So one of the things that makes this different from what might be in a YA book is that it depicts what today we would call a situationship. This book takes place around 1989 to 93 and was written early 2000s. So it's interesting to see that this is not some kind of like new phenomenon. It's just a new term.
Yeah.
I wonder what you made of the central, not very romantic relationship.
I think that the relationship, if you want to call it that, between Lee and Cross ends up being kind of this little like microcosm of everything going on with her, with wanting to belong, but also not feeling like she belongs. In my memory of the book, I remembered even the name Cross Sugarman. That stayed with me for a full 20 years. It's such like a prep school jock name. Characters are very well named in this book. But I had remembered it as Lee was in love with this man and he like repeatedly screwed her over, right? He wanted to hook up but not tell anybody. That's how I had remembered it all these years. And so one of the really surprising parts of rereading it was that it's actually Lee who says, we don't have to tell anyone about this.
Yeah.
Don't tell anyone. And I don't think that Cross otherwise was prepared to have a full-fledged public relationship with her, but it was just another example of her kind of counting herself out from that, trying to get ahead of feeling rejected by just removing herself from that, removing that possibility. And when things kind of blow up at the end, he brings that up.
Yeah, you said it.
You said it. And so what can you expect when you are preempting a relationship with that? And so that was surprising to me. And of course, not to make this feel like a therapy session, but of course reminds me of so many of my own relationships and, in my teenage years and early 20s, where I think that's a really common pattern for people, is you can tell that maybe you don't quite belong with this person. You can tell that maybe you're going to be rejected. And so all the ways that you kind of get ahead of that ultimately are not serving you at all.
I'm going to subject you some more of your writing.
Sure. Oh, gosh.
Because you talk about this in your book. I actually think the passage from Prep is toward the end, where she's reflecting on her relationships at the school and then also a little bit later in her adulthood. And you also talk about in your book, which again, can't recommend enough, some earlier relationships in your younger adulthood, a harrowing story, but so worth reading. So here's the passage from Prep. For years and years, there would be so many things I'd do for a guy that I wouldn't do in my usual life. Jokes I wouldn't normally tell, places I wouldn't normally go, clothes I wouldn't normally wear, drinks I wouldn't normally drink, food I wouldn't normally eat. I ride along anyway because apparently what I want from the guy is worth more than everything else I want or believe. It must be, right? And then we have a passage from you in one of your, I think, earlier essays in the book, where you're talking about a relationship with someone previous in your life. And you say, I would backpedal, change my answer, feeling the tension rising in the room with each word, walking back my story until it matched the one he wanted to hear, rewriting my own life until I was a blank page for him. Both of those describe similar experiences, right? Of trying to belong when you know you do not and don't really want to in your heart and need that kind of that good old male validation that we need or feel we need in those younger years. Did you kind of see that connection, or how does it feel to see those things put side by side? Sorry if I'm torturing you.
No. It's jarring in a really interesting way to hear them side by side like that. Yeah, I think there's a lot of women everywhere who would relate a lot to that passage in Prep, sometimes in just kind of like silly, fluffy little ways when you're older, thinking about like, oh my God, remember that time in college where I let this guy play me this song on guitar and it was so cringy and awful, but like, sometimes you sit through dumb things, or like, yeah, I told this guy I like this band because I wanted to go out with him and it turns out I hate this band, but like, don't tell him. Like, I think a lot of us have those experiences of going along with things, or, trying a food or a drink that we wouldn't normally do.
Yeah.
Very slow losses of identity. And ideally you kind of get those back, right? You're like, never mind, this is not it.
You grow up a bit.
You grow up a bit and you solidify your identity. I think the passage in my book, Poets Square, that's from the essay Sad Boy and Lola, there's a scarier tone there, because in that situation, it's not just, I'm going to try to tell him what he wants to hear because I want to be with him. It's like, this is going to escalate into a fight. This is going to escalate into something violent or scary if I can't kind of conform my story to what he wants to hear. Which I think ultimately is just like the next level of that kind of slow loss of identity, right? If you practice enough, like giving away parts of yourself like that, you reach the point where you're like, I'll give it all away. Just like, don't hurt me. Don't leave me. Just stay with me. Just, I think that's the risk of wanting that, craving that belonging so intensely and not finding it anywhere else in your life, that you can end up with someone who can kind of dangle that sense of belonging and safety in a really scary way.
And you're not just performing that belonging, you're truly trying to make yourself into that person, right? In a way that continues after that interaction. It's not just I'm pretending to like a band, but like I will fundamentally shovel out my personality and reshape it to be what you want me to be, something that is impossible and can never be done.
Yeah, and I find myself now in my 30s kind of reminiscing about teenage years and early 20s with friends who we tell a lot of those stories like they're funny stories now. We're like, remember the time you went to see Dave Matthews Band? And we're like, that was so stupid. I hated them. You can kind of tell it like, oh, dating, whatever, like we're all better now. There is such a kind of pervasive, scary aspect of that, of how much you're willing to give away and like take on other people's personalities as your own, or, changing to suit whoever you're dating.
We all want to be on the journey to being our true selves, not some other person.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is really sad. And obviously, the relationship you're describing is really quite scary, quite unhealthy, and thankfully in the past. Did you have any like feelings or memories come up as you were reading this about your younger self or just your experience from now to then?
I mean, I think the biggest surprise was just how different a book it was now. And it's not, it's the same book, literally. It's how different I am now. And so there were so many things that I read and took away from it at 14 that I think I really took away the wrong things. I had such kind of a warped perspective on it for so many years. So really interesting to reread as myself now. I mean, I remember, I think at 14, I was so anxious. I was such an overthinker. I felt very much kind of outside of social norms and friendships and dating and, things that seem to come naturally to a lot of other people my age. That I remember reading the book and just thinking, like, Lee is great. Lee is doing her best. I remember reading the parts about her cutting hair and feeling like, oh yeah, she figured it out. What a great way to get close to people. I remember thinking of it as like a guidebook. And I was like, I just need a really cool skill that I can bring to school to like get close to people and make people like me. I mean, I think I read a lot of books as a teenager and young adult as guidebooks. I was really reading, looking for characters and narrators that I related to, and then looking at, well, what did they do? How did they survive this? And trying to follow those. And that's not what you should do. I mean, barely related, but I will always remember the first time I read The Bell Jar, and I had no context. I hadn't otherwise studied Sylvia Plath. I didn't know a single thing. And I related so much to the main character that halfway through the book, I was like, I can't wait to see what happens at the end, because like, this is great. Like, this is me. I'm going to follow this like a guidebook for life. And then I got to the end and I looked up Sylvia Plath and I was like, oh, this is not good.
Uh-oh.
Like, this is not this is not who you should be like following, like a guidebook for life, right? So really, really different to read prep now. I'm like, girl, you should not be giving haircuts as a means to kind of feign closeness to people, right? Like that's not belonging. That's not intimacy. So there's so much now. I mean, I'll probably bring it up to my therapist because there is so much now that I'm like, I read this so differently at age 14 that it's almost concerning.
Yeah, you chose a passage about the haircutting. We're going to dig into that later, but that's the difference between child reading and adult reading, right? Which is like child reading. And I think we do sometimes like present the books to kids like this is going to teach you something. And that is sort of taken as this is a guidebook. This is to teach me a lesson. Whatever happens in here is what I'm supposed to do. And while as an adult, it's to make meaning. And those are different processes. And you actually have to be able to separate your idea of yourself from what's in the book and like really like develop perspective that you probably can't do when you're a teen, which is okay.
Yeah.
It's making me feel a bit weird because like normally I'm kind of an advocate for kind of let kids read whatever they want. Like don't restrict reading. I think it's like with care, right? Because you can be taken almost too literally. In a way.
Yeah. I read all sorts of stuff as a kid, and I think it was great for me. I think it introduced me to a lot of things that maybe were beyond what I would have found in young adult books. But I think that should all happen with a conversation, right? Probably one of my parents should have read that and be like, anything you want to talk about from this book? I didn't have friends at the time who were big readers that we would have passed the book around and talked about it or anything like that. So everything I read kind of sat and stewed in my own head with no kind of context or conversation around it. So that makes a big difference too.
Yeah, absolutely. Reading is a community affair, or it should be if we can make it that way. When we first talked, you remembered, I think we may have kind of like conflated a few things in our memory of the book. You talked about the relationship she had with this older man who worked at the school. What did you make of that part and that relationship?
That was really interesting to reread because I did remember that. In my memory, that was a really like central moment to the plot. And it's really not in the book. It's a pretty fleeting, they don't actually even go out on a real date. They meet and they talk about it. And then he talks to her once in the cafeteria and some of the other classmates are like, are you talking to the kitchen guy? And like, that's it. I don't know why that was something that spoke to me or that stayed with me for so long. I think maybe it was just the real illustration of the class differences, that to her he was just a guy and he was easy to talk to and he showed interest in her, which just wasn't really happening anywhere else in her life. And so it was really easy for her to say like, okay, let's go out. Then to kind of be presented so sharply with, I think it's her roommate or her old roommate, Dee Dee, who's like, are you talking to a townie? Like,
Yeah.
that's not who you are. You belong here. Yeah, so she's kind of confronted for maybe one of the first times with, there are very real differences between the people who go here and the people who maybe work here as staff. I think it was probably the first time in my life I heard the word townie that had just not entered my vocabulary before, and I would go on to hear it many times in my life. I went to undergrad at the school in my hometown, and so a lot of people came from elsewhere to go to that school and would regularly talk about the townies, the people who grew up there, and I was like, surprise, I'm both.
Yeah.
That would grow to be something I spent quite a lot of time thinking about. Really, really interesting how much that stood out to me. And it wasn't about the age difference at all. The things that stood out to me about that are not what would stand out to me now.
Sometimes things are just mysterious. We don't always know why some things stick with us and some things don't. It is a moment where she, I think, like has that identity formation of like, oh, I am different, because Midwest Lee, previous Lee, there'd be nothing unusual about a community college student other than like maybe your mom would say he's a little old for you, but it wouldn't be someone who's like inappropriate or like somehow not on your level, doesn't belong to your category. She didn't have that hierarchy in her head prior to joining this like pretty rigid society.
And I think we start to see in that moment, and then again when her parents are visiting, how she ends up in this kind of no man's land where she does not feel like she belongs with everyone else at all. She doesn't feel like she belongs at the school. She doesn't feel like she belongs with everyone who grew up rich and has, well-known parents and all of that. But she also starts to feel like, in contrast to visiting her hometown or seeing her parents or potentially dating a townie, she's marked now as being part of the alt community. She's a very privileged member of a very fancy boarding school. And so she starts to kind of feel like she doesn't belong in either. And that's a really interesting place to be.
The Parents' Weekend chapter feels like it's pulled from life. You can feel the pain, the angst, the humiliation of that experience and truly not belonging to either. And I think feeling very, very alone, and just those kind of knockdown, drag out fights that stay with you for decades.
As an adult, rediscovering Curtis Sittenfeld, and I've read some of her other work now, that section with Parents' Weekend feels one of the most like quintessentially Curtis Sittenfeld to me, more so than any of the chapters that, take place with just Lee at school. The dynamics between her family and the fights with her parents, and especially with her dad. She does such a wonderful job getting to like them being angry, but then there's these little moments where he'll like make a little joke and she's like, okay, he forgives me. And those really subtle kind of family dynamics are done so well in that chapter. And it's so hard to read. It really is.
It's so hard to read.
It's painful.
It's so painful. He hears that one of the other children at alt has a parent who's a senator, and he's like, I'm going to go introduce myself to the senator. And you can feel the abject horror of your townie dad acting so embarrassing toward this esteemed person. Looking back on an adult, it's like, whatever. This senator shakes hands with randos all the time. You have nothing to worry about, but the idea of it is like just viscerally painful. You really feel that.
Yeah, or when her parents take two of the other girls out to dinner with them, and the girls assume that they're going to the really fancy restaurant that everyone goes to, but they're not. They're going to, I think it's like a cheap Chinese buffet. And the girls order soda because they just do. And Lee is like, we don't do that in my family. Like, she's like, I know that my dad is noticing this because we always just get water. Those tiny little details that Lee is just hyper aware of because she is seeing like my family's not meeting the expectations of other students and the students are not meeting the expectations of my family. And I'm in the middle.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us don't experience that until college or beyond, if you move far away from home or you start to meet other kinds of people. But to experience that as a high school student where you're really just hyper aware of, my family is so different from these people. I'm somehow not part of any of this. She's kind of staying on top of what everyone is doing and trying to make sure that everything goes smoothly in a really like heightened weekend.
Yeah, the impossible tasks that an overthinker sets for themselves.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything for every person involved must be just right, impossible to achieve.
Yeah, relatable.
Relatable for you? Do you feel like you're still like that, or maybe a little less than you were when you first read it?
Less than I was when I first read it, happily. I think it's still easy to end up I think for a lot of people, but I'll speak only about myself. I live far away from family. I have kind of a whole other life doing what I do now. And I think you can still feel that tension pretty easily if family comes to visit and you're like introducing them to your friends or your partner, or you're showing them where you work or whatever. I think it's still really easy to end up in those situations where you're like, okay, can you just be normal for a minute? And then like, can you guys just be nice?
Yeah.
And I feel like people see that at, weddings, big family events, holidays. It's like the classic tension of hosting holidays is like people from different spheres coming together and being like, everyone just be normal. Don't mention this thing. Your politics are different, but like, don't bring it up. I feel like it's still pretty easy to end up in those situations where you feel responsible for everything going smoothly.
Yes. An impossible burden to carry.
Yes.
Anything else you wanted to bring up about how things read differently this time before we move on to our theme discussion?
I know we're going to talk more about Martha, so I won't say too much about her, but I will say that in my initial reading as a teenager, I kind of barely remembered Martha. She wasn't a character who stood out to me, which is so interesting reading it now because Martha is amazing. Martha is such a hero of the book.
Oh, yes.
That was really interesting to me, but I know we'll get more into Martha's character.
Absolutely. I think one of the most interesting characters in the book, and a mystery where her goodness comes from. She's so good.
Yeah.
I love Martha. We'll get into that. So, in each episode, we choose a theme to read the text through, and you have chosen the theme of belonging. We see that belonging come up in so many places, and we've talked a lot already about the class dimensions that are present in this story. It made me think about how to be of a privileged class is to be certain in your belonging, to even feel entitled, to be somewhere. And a weird place where I saw belonging show up is in the haircutting, because some of the boarding school students who are a little bit more upper class, who are the popular kids that Lee temporarily gets close to because she's cutting someone's hair. Aspeth is the character's name, and her crush, the slick college boy Cross Sugarman, is also present. And I think she gets her hair cut. And they just leave the hair on the floor for her to clean up. And they have such a firm sense of belonging, like an entitlement to this space. They're like, I know I belong here. I know I can't really get in trouble for anything. I own this place. And she is sort of meekly coming after them, like going to borrow a dustpan and like cleaning up because she doesn't want to be obtrusive, to be noticed, to be remarked upon. And it made me think a lot about how class and belonging go hand in hand. You don't think as much about belonging if you know that you belong.
That's such an interesting example. It's such a moment in the book because I think that ends up being maybe the last or one of the last haircuts she does. She's been doing that for a while.
Yeah.
Aspeth Montgomery, again, such a name, and she has the long blonde hair, and she's the pinnacle of the rich popular girls. And it's such a moment when she asks Lee to cut her hair because Lee is like, I've made it. I have the most popular girl in school. Everyone has a crush on her. Coming to me to cut her hair. Like, I'm going to touch her hair. I'm going to cut her hair. We're going to chat. It's such a moment that she does that. And then for it to kind of just crumple in this moment, which of course we see coming, like the horror movie. We know that this isn't real belonging. We know that she's not forming real social bonds with these people whose hair she's cutting. So to see that coming and then to see this moment where Aspeth and Cross just walk away and Lee is just standing there. And I actually just reread that and Lee says, hey, Aspeth, there's still a lot of hair here. And Aspeth says, oh, there's not that much, and just keeps going. It's such a wild moment to be so certain that you belong in a space. No one's going to kick you out for anything you do at that point. No one's going to judge anything you do. That such a firm sense of I belong here and I can do whatever I want is so foreign to Lee as the main character, and to me, at least, maybe to most of us.
Yeah, and it made me realize that like an extreme amount of belonging or too much belonging is like entitlement. Yeah, and their relationship is transactional. It's not a true, like, belonging to one another. It's not a true friendship.
Yeah. And I think Lee's roommate freshman year, one of her roommates, Dee Dee, is another really interesting. I mean, I would read the same book from Dee Dee's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I think Dee Dee craves the same kind of belonging with kind of the same intensity that Lee does, but her way of getting there is conforming and following Aspeth around and trying to become Aspeth's best friend very intentionally,
Yeah.
showing up where she shows up and going to the same events and kind of ingratiating herself to her until she becomes part of that group and is one of the popular kids. And it's such a different path than what Lee takes. Lee sees that and it's just like, I don't want any part of that. I'm gonna, wish for the same level of belonging, but I'm gonna sit in my room and do nothing about it. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, and she discounts the moments where she has experienced belonging, like this moment where she ends up having like a happenstance hangout with Cross early in the book, where he kind of rescues her from a situation at the mall, and everything about it afterwards, she's like, that was a one-off, that was a freak thing. I actually don't belong here. That core belief of I don't belong is so strong.
Yeah.
Even when there's evidence in her face that shows that she does.
Yeah. I thought that part was so interesting reading it back, that she spends the rest of the day with them, right? Cross and his friends. They go to the movies, they get some food, they take a cab back to school together. And so I feel like probably a more healthy brain would have concluded, oh, that was cool. I made some new friends. I hung out with some new people. Next time I see them in the dorms, I'll wave hello and maybe I'll see them again. And instead, her instant belief is that was a fluke. That was a one-off. I can't believe they chose to spend a day with me, but that's crazy. It'll never happen again. And it seems like so many of her social interactions happen that way. One of the big plot points that I always loved was the game of assassin. They're each assigned a person to, quote unquote, kill by putting a sticker on them, and goes down to whoever's last. And Lee becomes so obsessed with that, and it's almost kind of parallel the hair cutting.
Yeah.
It's like kind of this facade to be able to get closer to people or interact with people that she normally wouldn't interact with. And it becomes like an inside joke with one of the guys that she, quote, kills, gets a sticker on him. And she does the whole, some of her dorm mates, and I think even one of the teachers, have like a fishing pole and they get a sticker down onto someone, and it's a whole, it's like this nice kind of natural moment of her socializing and giggling and like doing fun things with people. And the moment it's over, she's like, that was over. That was a fluke. Those aren't people I'm going to otherwise like hang out with or socialize with. That core belief that keeps coming back to her.
She says multiple times that her nightmare is to meet up again with someone she just had a good interaction with, and that she avoids those people.
Yeah.
Just because I know it's not possible to have another good interaction. I have to avoid them. I don't belong. It's so strong.
Yeah, it was shocking to me how strong it was reading it back as an adult, and how many of her kind of patterns of thinking are wrong and unhealthy, and
yeah,
you just want to course correct her. You just want to be like, that could have been a friend. Go just go wave to them again,
Yeah. So we actually have the word belonging show up a few times in the text, and she says that she feels the most belonging at Alt when her parents come. She says, my sense of belonging had perhaps never been as acute as on this evening, and I don't know if I recognized it then. Later, it was obvious. But surely the timing was no coincidence. It was because my parents were coming, and because I knew they would not belong. So she's kind of setting herself up in a contrast, being like maybe trying to convince herself, trying to break out of that belief in non-belonging. But I'm not actually sure that I think that's true. I don't think that her parents don't belong there necessarily, and her parents aren't bothered about it the way that she is. Because they're adults.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting too. Her parents don't share the same anxieties about, our car is older than what all the other parents are driving, or we come from a different background or anything like that. They're just there. They're excited to see the campus. Yeah, and she's kind of caught in that tension. And to only feel a sense of belonging through that contrast, that there's someone else who belongs even less than she does.
Yeah.
Is not a true sense of belonging at all,
No, it's like a very classic, I only build myself up by putting others down kind of childhood binary thinking.
Yeah.
No possibility for us to all belong together. It's like, I belong because you don't.
Yeah.
But when her parents visit, she's very paranoid that they don't belong, but it kind of strikes me as sort of typical teenage embarrassment, as class anxiety rather than a real class problem. There's
real forces at work there that are, belonging or not belonging, but there's also this underlying teenage anxiety of all of it that just heightens absolutely everything. Again, as an adult, especially interesting to read and kind of try to tease out, what here is actually her realizing she's not in the same class as some of these students versus what is teenage anxiety that is simply not going to be the end of the world, And we see it at the end where she's kind of doing those flash ahead moments to where she ends up. Like, she meets up with Dee Dee in the future. She meets up with some of her classmates who she had seemed so different from in these like irreconcilable ways. And it's like, oh, we're just people and we went to the same school and now we're adults,
Yeah, my favorite instance of that is later. I think it's implied that they're kind of in their 30s and she's still friends with Martha, and Martha meets up with Cross Sugarman and his wife. And it's so clear that he is just a man.
Yeah, exactly.
Martha calls her and is like, he's like making us go out and look at the golf clubs in his trunk. And they're like gossiping about him. And now he's just some guy they went to school with.
He's just some guy.
Yeah. And she had lionized him, as this kind of like a paragon of masculinity. And then he's just like the most some guy ever at the end.
Yeah. Curtis Sittenfeld does it so well, the way you can become wrapped up with Lee and seeing all these other students as either the most popular or kind of the outcast, or that's just such a teenage, and maybe specifically teenage girl kind of view. I mean, being a teenage girl with anxiety is hell.
Hell.
Because your brain is on overdrive at all times.
Attacking you viciously 24/7, 365.
Yeah. In a way that, God, to be in your 30s and kind of have a reprieve from that and be like, I don't have to think about any of that.
I rebuke.
Is so, it's so amazing to reach that point and be like, oh, none of that mattered at all.
No.
So it's really interesting to see that tangled up with all of these also kind of real things about, class and differences between people. And we really haven't touched on race, but that's a whole other aspect that we see in some of the other students in really interesting ways. There's so many instances. The one that really stands out to me is Little Washington at the beginning, who is Black. And I had remembered this scene and I had remembered it happening way later in the book, but it's very, very early in the book. I think it's Dee Dee or maybe Aspeth, one of the kind of popular blonde girls, who's complaining that someone keeps leaving their pubes in the sink, in their shared dorm sink.
Oh.
And it's, a whole thing. No one knows who's doing it, but it's gross. Don't leave your pubes in the sink. And it turns out that it's Little Washington, who is Black, and is trimming her hair on her head into the sink. And that people seeing that hair texture are interpreting that as pubic hair. And that was so striking to me at the time, that so many of these students are white to the point of not being familiar with other hair textures and othering her to the point of thinking her hair is pubic hair. There's so much happening there.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Little Washington is revealed to also be the thief in the dorm, which I'm curious about kind of the critical reception of that and how folks have maybe thought about that since. But she leaves school and then we never hear about her again, right?
Yeah, it's just dehumanized, like not just othered, but like dehumanized, to have your body kind of stigmatized in that way. And we don't learn what was behind the thievery.
No, we really don't. But it's interesting because she, Little, is kind of the first person that Lee approaches to like maybe be friends with. The night that there's a dance, they're two of the only students that don't go to the dance. And Lee goes and knocks on her door and just kind of tries to hang out with her. It's one of the only times we see her kind of like making a gesture toward friendship or like trying to get to know someone. And so it's interesting that the one person she kind of connects with right off the bat is this person who has been othered or kind of visibly doesn't belong.
Yes, it's like there's maybe not many people that she, in her very black and white teenage brain, would think of as below her on the totem pole. Kind of a safe person to make friends with.
Yeah.
You would not be like rejected or stigmatized by that person. You're going to be doing the rejecting and the stigmatizing. And you're very magnanimous by just like making that overture toward them in her head. Obviously this is like incredible problematic way to think. Now that I'm thinking about it through the framework of belonging, the two that I'm really interested in are Conchita and Shinyun. And Shinyun is very noticeably different. There's this whole plot line of her and her like stinky food. She is like really does not belong in a way that is painful Shinjun even tries to exit the stage, right? Like she truly believes that she does not belong.
Yeah, we have Shinjun with the stinky fish, which becomes a thing, and then kind of revealing later that she's also queer. And there's actually a moment when Lee is, I think, kind of preparing stuff to take to the hospital for Shinjun or helping her at some point after that when she's leaving school. And Lee says something about like, I couldn't believe it. Like even Shinjun was feeling this way in terms of mental health or depression or not wanting to be there or not feeling like she belonged. It was so surprising to Lee that even Shinjun felt the same way she did. That like, oh, someone who very visibly doesn't belong also feels the same way that I do.
That just has to be like teenage selfishness and blinders. Because why wouldn't she? Like, look at the way she's been treated.
Right.
Right? Like, that should be obvious to you.
Yeah.
She's, I think, very wrapped up in her own sadness and misery and doesn't necessarily see what that would have been like in like the 80s to be this Asian queer. Like, she's got a lot on her plate, Shinjun.
Yeah.
But she thrives in adulthood. We see her in adulthood being this like queer scientist.
She ends up being such a cool character, but such an interesting first year roommate for Lee.
And there's some real drama that takes place where they kind of decide not to live together. She decides not to live with this other immigrant student, Conchita, who has a more complicated story of belonging because she's got all the class privilege in the world, but she doesn't naturally fit in and belong. She speaks with an accent. She is Mexican, I think.
The backstory was that her dad was the one with the money and her mom was the dad's cleaning lady. He had an affair with the cleaning lady. And so she comes from money. She has the kind of wealth behind her. She was the product of an affair with someone of a lower class who was Mexican. And so there's a lot there. But yeah, what was really interesting about Conchita is that Lee keeps noticing she dresses in these crazy outfits. She has all the money in the world. She could conform. She could wear exactly what everyone else wears. She has that opportunity. And yet she wears these colorful hats and she almost goes out of her way to look different. And for Lee, that's like bewildering. You have the opportunity to fit in here and you're kind of choosing not to. And that's so out of the ordinary for her. That was really interesting to me too.
But Conchita, she comes across initially as like maybe a bit neurodivergent, right? Like she just really marches to her own drum. She also maybe comes across as like a coddled or homeschooled child. She also doesn't know how to ride a bike, right? Like she just is an indoor cat all sudden out with outdoor cats who have life experience. And she learns to conform. And at the end, she performs this ultimate act of conformity, which is that she changes her wardrobe, she takes on the trappings of the private school kid, and she ingratiates herself to the school with this speech that she makes to condemn Lee for, which we haven't even talked about this.
Yeah.
The coda to this story where she speaks to a journalist and kind of spills her guts about the real life at private school, and I think creates some problems for Alt and for her classmates, like kind of speaking truth or maybe even a little bit of exaggeration about the many kind of problems and class issues at boarding school. And Conchita seizes this opportunity and is able to belong by doing this act of condemnation, which I thought was so interesting because they started out as friends.
I would read this book from the perspective of any one of these characters. I mean, they each go through such a kind of individual journey. And I think Conchita's especially is so fascinating because she comes from, like you said, maybe kind of a homeschooled background. She's got the wealth behind her, but the kind of cultural sense that she has is so different from everyone else at the school. She also, quote unquote, kills Lee in the game of Assassin. She was kind of protecting her. And then, you know, in this moment of betrayal when Lee decides to room with Martha the following year, she puts that sticker on her. And then, yeah, by the end of the book has kind of fully conformed into being one of the other prep students there. And it's like once she has that opportunity to fit in and be one of them, she takes that and runs with it.
She makes that trade, you know, for her individuality to belong.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perhaps that she's perceived as weird by other people, and Lee could not at that early stage in her journey at all attach herself to someone who's perceived as other, who's perceived as weird. And even though she seems to love Conchita and their friends, she can't room with her.
It was kind of incomprehensible to her. Like it came up several times, the hat that Conchita had been wearing at one point, how she just keeps remembering, like, why would she wear a hat like that? And it's incomprehensible to her that someone would choose to wear a weird hat and be perceived that way when you could just not. I mean, that's very much 14-year-old girl anxiety for sure.
Yes.
But it's interesting to see how different. I mean, Conchita is also a high school girl at that time and just has such a different take on the world or understanding of the world.
I hope she flowers back into her uniqueness as an adult, because it's sad. It's sad what happens to her.
It is.
Yeah, it made me think about high school and me being afraid of catching the like goth emo germs from the other kids that were in theater class with me, even though they were like the most fun people, the most accepting people.
Yeah.
And I chose instead to be at the very, very bottom of the rung of like a Mean Girls clique and let the equivalent of Regina George boss me around.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Even though once we were in drama together, it was like I loved those people. They were so much fun, but I was like, I can't catch these weird kid germs. I have to fit in. And now I look back and like, those people were awesome.
Yeah.
Those people were cool. They were artistic. They were being themselves. I was like, oh my God, it reminded me of me for her to like reject Conchita.
Yeah.
Ugh, it's hard to be a teen. It's hard to be a teen.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's concerning to relate to this book a little too much and be like, oh gosh, if I had had more guidance as a teenager.
I don't know if there's a way to get perspective on that when you're in the middle of it.
It's true. Yeah, all you can really do is live through it.
Yeah, one more thing that I thought was really interesting about belonging was she's very, very desperate to fit in, desperate to belong, and there is a arc. It's revealed that in some fundamental ways she doesn't belong because she can't keep up. She can't do the math. And she says about her imminent flunking of pre-calculus, the other people's reaction was the only thing that counted to me.
Yeah.
It was the only thing she cared about. It was fitting in, not the actual consequences of not knowing the math, which was so interesting to me. We're going to talk a little bit about Martha's act of love, I think, saving her in math.
Yeah. It's so interesting, again, to read this 20 years later and see what stuck with me. And I thought I had a pretty good memory of the book, and I really did not. I mean, there were certain aspects that stood out. There were some exact lines that I still remembered, and yet I did not remember that part of the plot at all. And in my memory, Lee was really academically gifted and excelled there. In my memory, she was kind of just the quiet, nerdy student who did all her homework and did great in school, even if she wasn't fitting in socially. And so rereading it, I was like, oh, she also was not fitting in academically. I mean, the very first chapter opens on her kind of getting her project wrong. There had been a mistake, and so she's kind of flailing in class from the very beginning. She flails in class with the young English teacher, and that's mostly anxiety, right? She doesn't want to read her papers out loud, and things get kind of weird in that class. But then with math, she just kind of loses it completely and doesn't really show the drive to, like you said, want to learn the math for that sake. She's not thinking ahead about everyone's applying to colleges. The Ivy Leagues are really big, and she's kind of counted herself out from that automatically, and is more worried about everyone's reactions than actually learning the math and thinking about her life and her career ahead. And
very little of that, right? We never find out what her career is. She doesn't really have dreams and hopes and aspirations for herself. Her only dream, hope, and aspiration is to fit in.
And it's so interesting because she, like we said earlier, she's the one who wants to go to this school in the first place. She's doing so well academically at home. There's no one pressuring her to go here. She's the one who's getting these brochures and putting together her application and begging to be able to go. She's clearly gifted enough or a hard enough worker that she gets the scholarship to go there out of presumably many, many applicants. And so it's almost like her feeling of not fitting in and her anxiety and her drive to feel that belonging overtake everything else to the point where the academics don't matter at all anymore. Even when she's faced with like, you're going to be kicked out, she still can't really get it together to get there.
It really puts such a fine point on how this type of anxiety can harm you, can hurt you, like can truly set you back, right? It's taking up so much mental real estate that it's stealing from her.
Yeah, exactly.
her hopes and dreams.
It becomes the only thing in her mind, and it's almost like a daily survival where she can't think ahead, she can't think about consequences, she can't really plan for anything else.
Yeah.
It's sad because she doesn't recognize it, and I mean, I think most of her peers and teachers would say, like, yeah, she probably has some anxiety. It's not invisible to people, but the kind of constant work that her brain is doing there is invisible to people, to the point that if she failed out of math and was kicked out, I don't think there would be a lot of people saying, oh, it's because she struggled with anxiety. It's because she was doing this in her brain every single day. She would just kind of be a failure, and that would be it. So I do think it's a really interesting and well done illustration of the ways that that kind of her core beliefs and her thinking and her anxiety, it can cause like material harm, right? She could flunk out, she could not go to college, it could affect the rest of her life in ways that are hard to see if you're not inside the inner workings of someone's brain the way we are in this book.
Yes, absolutely. On that plot point, I want to ask you about Martha and this selfless act of love.
Yeah.
This risk that Martha takes to allow Lee to stay at the school. She very much breaks a rule. She breaks a norm, and she does something that she probably thinks is wrong. Lee is crumbling, collapsing, not able to finish a take-home exam, and Martha does it for her.
Yeah.
What did you make of that? Martha is there with her through thick and thin. Why is Martha like that? She's a good person.
It's something that I find myself sometimes still asking of people in my own life, where I'm like, how'd you get this way? You know?
Yeah.
How did you end up so good in what feels like such a simple way? You know, I feel like most of the time, that example being the exception, because clearly Martha has a lot at stake there and she thinks about that decision before she makes it. But I feel like a lot of the time, we don't see Martha like agonizing over should she hang out with Cross because they're prefects together, or should she be doing this with Lee, or like we don't get a ton of like her childhood, but I think we can assume that she just has a pretty strong foundation and a pretty strong sense of self and a brain that just doesn't get wrapped up in anxiety the way that Lee's does.
And is not corrupted by being around highly entitled, ultra wealthy people. She spends so much time with Cross.
Yeah.
Right? She spends time with people who have adopted these like very problematic ways of thinking and are exercising power in problematic ways. And she's good.
Yeah, she's just kind of this stable, sturdy, good person who just does things. I mean, probably the most interesting thing we see is the example with the math test.
Mm-hmm.
I remember my heart speeding up a little bit because I was like, this is a real test of Martha. You know, we know that this goes against her values. We know that this is a huge risk for her to take. And she still goes through with it to save Lee.
To save Lee, and out of, I think, like love for her friend, that I think maybe I hope that Lee would see that this is like a real affirmation of belonging, being like, I don't want to be at the school without you. You know, like you belong in my life as the friendship that supersedes the school and will endure past the school. That not everything is about alt, right? That like this is life.
And at the same time, Martha is such a representation of alt, though. She becomes prefect when a lot of people thought that she probably wouldn't become prefect. I mean, she excels at academics. She plays, I think, field hockey.
Yeah.
Her parents are professors. She comes from some money. Like, she's very much the embodiment of the school at the same time that she kind of rises above that to also just be a good friend to Lee.
Yes.
And it does feel like Lee still cannot accept that as proof of her belonging there or you know, deserving to have good friends or anything like that. She's still kind of questioning, what does Martha get from me? Why is she choosing to be my friend? Like,
Martha seems to have risen above the sort of pecking order of the school. She doesn't care about that stuff. One last thing about belonging I want to bring up before we move on is that toward the end of the book, Lee is responsible for setting off this bomb at the school in the form of speaking maybe a little too candidly to a reporter about the real social dynamics and what's really going on at alt. And I'm kind of wondering if there's something in there about people who don't quite belong being able to be truth tellers, people who have a bit of distance being able to offer critique in a way that people who are fully enmeshed and who fully belong and feel entitled to be there aren't able to do because they can't gain that perspective. Or is this just like a stupid impulsive thing that she does? How do you interpret that through the lens of belonging?
I think it's both, and I think it's such a complex setup in the book. It's yet another part that I have just read so differently now than I did as a teenager. As a teenager, did read it as I read it as Lee doing a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I read it as the outsiders kind of being the ones who could like speak truth to power. And, like Aspeth could never have that take on a school like that, right? Because to her experience there was fully different. And so like there is something there about people like Lee, students on scholarship, students coming from different backgrounds, having a different experience there and being able to share that. But reading it now, I'm also seeing how much of Lee's experience there was so much more about her anxiety and her own brain than it ever was about where she actually came from or the treatment that she got there.
Yeah.
She, at that time, is not able to identify that or untangle those things. And so I think it does end up being that a lot of what she says to the reporter about not belonging and the way that she's treated is a lot more about herself than it is about the school environment there. And the reporter doesn't untangle those things. There's a lot that Lee says that she assumes will not end up in this article. So I think the reporter is maybe not 100% ethical in using teenagers to kind of drop this bombshell of an article. But the reaction from the other students is so interesting because it turns out most of them don't feel that way, including, I think, one of the other Black students, Darden.
Yeah, she sort of speaks over them a little bit.
Yeah, it's such an interesting plot point in there because there is so much happening. And I think that Lee was maybe a little bit taken advantage of by the reporter, didn't have a full understanding to fully consent to realize that the things she's saying could have this effect or be used in the way that they were used. And so there's a good bit of sympathy there for her that she didn't really mean to end up in this situation. And she is speaking truthfully about her experience. I don't think that she thinks she's exaggerating. She's not trying to lie about her experience there. But yeah, I think she doesn't realize how much of her experience was about her rather than all the kind of outside factors that she thinks it's about.
Yeah, and seeing everybody else close ranks and defend alt, even when they also might share some of those critiques, that's something that happens when someone externally is negative about your institution that you belong to, even if you have problems with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
They want to perform their belonging by condemning her.
Yeah, and that's when we see, Conchita make that kind of final move to, no, I belong here. I'm on this side. You're the outsider now.
We have arrived at our close reading segment. This is the time when I like to say we turn the book upside down, shake it, and try to get some new meanings. You have chosen a passage in which Lee catches her roommate Martha trying to sneakily leave campus to get a haircut. And she is famous for giving haircuts and doing a good job. They have a conversation about this that we're going to read. But I want to ask you first, what made you want to spend some more time with this passage?
I think the subplot of the haircutting is so fascinating because, she falls into it accidentally, right? This guy walks into the dorm when no one else is there and is like, I need a haircut right this second. And so she does it. But it becomes her thing that she kind of uses as a way to get close to people very temporarily, or to feel like she has a connection with someone or an intimacy with someone. She gets this reputation. Some people learn her name who maybe didn't know her name before. It becomes this thing that she's proud of, this thing that she's known for. I think it was one of the most interesting moments in the book when Martha, who we see again and again, truly wants the best for Lee, right? It would have been different if it were Dee Dee or Aspeth or one of the other characters kind of calling Lee out on what she's doing with these haircuts. But it's coming from Martha, who we know is just good at heart. She's so pure. She genuinely loves and values Lee. And so to see her kind of calling her out on why are you doing this? What are you gaining from this? It's such a kind of heartfelt moment between them, and also kind of a moment where it shatters the glass for Lee a little bit.
It's not in the passage, but right before this, she says, I think you cut people's hair, especially boys, as this way of having contact with them without having to really get close. That's so incisive. And it is like only a real friend is going to like call you out,
Right.
properly call you out. That's someone who loves you and knows you.
And she really hesitates saying it. You can really tell that she's like, I don't know if this is gonna like start a fight. I don't know if this is worth saying. But she sees it and she calls it out. And again, if anyone else had said that to Lee, it would have been a really different reaction from her.
So I was thinking that a good reading technique for this would be Ignatian reading, which is sometimes called sacred imagination. So I'm going to have Courtney read the passage for us very shortly. And listeners, if you are in a safe place, not driving, you can close your eyes and try to picture yourself into this scene. Who are you? Where are you? Are you a fly on the wall? Are you Martha? Are you Lee? Are you a student peeking your head in? And what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you notice? Courtney, would you read this passage for us?
Sure. Does everyone think that about me? That I cut hair so that... I wanted to say so that I can talk to boys even though I'm a loser. But Martha hated it when I insulted myself. Of course not, she grinned. People are too busy thinking about themselves. No one was ever better at reassuring me than Martha. Before tests, she reassured me that I could pass, and before formal dinner, she reassured me that my clothes looked okay. And before I went home for Christmas or the summer, she reassured me that my plane wouldn't crash. She reassured me that no one had noticed when I tripped walking out of chapel, that I would be happy in college, that it didn't matter if I'd spilled root beer on her futon cover, and that I didn't have bad breath. If I doubted her, she would lean her face in and say, "Okay, breathe on me. Go ahead, I don't care." Sometimes still, I think, what did I ever give back to you? I'll be gone a couple hours, Martha said. Don't go to dinner without me, okay? I nodded. I would have been able to tell you'd gotten a haircut. Even if you snuck out, I'd know when you got back. Yeah, well, she grinned. Remind me never to go into espionage. As I watched her leave, my mind shot ahead to a time in the future when we would not share a room, when our daily lives would not overlap. The idea made me feel as if I were being held underwater. Then I thought, you're being ridiculous. You have almost 3 more years together, and I could breathe again. But I knew, I always knew. And as unhappy as I often was, the knowledge never made me feel better. Instead, it seemed the worst part of all, that our lives at Alt were only temporary.
Listeners, take note of who you were, what you came up with as you were listening to this passage. How did you feel? What did you notice? Courtney, how did that wash over you? Where were you in this passage? What did you notice on this read?
I mean, what stands out to me from the first time I read it is kind of the multiple, like, parentheticals and em dashes and italics within that feel like we're inside of Lee's mind. So really, this is a very short exchange between Lee and Martha. The actual dialogue in quotations is very short. But we've got these long paragraphs because so much of this, the thinking ahead, the thinking we still have 3 more years, the kind of aside about all the ways that Martha reassures Lee, all of this is like happening inside of Lee's head during this conversation.
This is a tour through a thought spiral.
Yeah, absolutely.
Down the spiral with her. One thing that I noticed is I was like a little student just peeking my head in the door, just seeing their outlines, right? Like, I know I'm not supposed to be here. I'm just eavesdropping. And the thing I heard while I was eavesdropping was her saying, people are too busy thinking about themselves.
Yeah.
Which is something that we've said a bunch of times in different ways in the course of this conversation, and something that an adult would say.
Yes. And Martha has that knowledge. She understands that in a way that maybe is not too common for teenagers to begin with, but especially contrasted with Lee, who I'm sure Martha tells her that all the time, and it just will not catch in her brain. It's not going to make sense to her, to feel true to her.
No, it doesn't stick at all. And it makes me think that Martha must have already gone through some kind of journey or identity forming process where she is more mature, that maybe when she was in elementary school or something, that she developed this. Like, how did she become so wise?
Right. I wish we did get a little bit of that backstory on Martha because it's so interesting because she too is, I think, only 15, 16 at most at this point in the book. And so to have that understanding, I see myself in Lee's head here. Being an adult now who understands no one is thinking about you, right? No one's thinking about any of that. They're all thinking about themselves. But also understanding, having been a teenager with a pretty similar brain as Lee's, I understand how flat that falls, how nonsensical it sounds. It doesn't feel reassuring, right? And then we see this whole list of all of the times that Martha has to reassure her and Lee not believing her to the point that even when Martha's like, your breath is fine, Lee's like, no, it must not be. And Martha's like, breathe on me then, I'll smell it. You know, like the level of reassurance that it takes to reach Lee is almost exhausting, even in that one little paragraph, that it makes sense that we're like, what does Martha get back from this friendship?
But we know that she does get something.
She does.
She says, don't go to dinner without me. She likes Lee's company.
It's such an easy reassurance that she's like, okay, well, I'll be right back. Don't leave without me.
It's a dream of a traumatized, anxious person to has this deep well of reassurance, which truly must exhaust Martha at some point.
It must.
The material support, right? It's like, breathe on me.
Right.
Breath, like an embodied thing. They're so close.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the only time we really see their friendship chafe a little bit is when Lee is meeting up with Cross secretly. And Martha obviously knows because they're roommates. And Martha is also prefects with Cross. And so Martha kind of ends up in this situation where she's like, can you do this somewhere else? Like, it's really not fair to me for me to kind of be in on this secret that is breaking the rules, and it's really not okay. And if I'm remembering correctly, Lee is even a little annoyed by that. She's like, Martha knows how much I want this. Like, why would Martha make a big deal about this? And it's such an interesting peek in Lee's mind there to see that, like, really with all that Martha gives her, she is still not necessarily respecting like a very small thing that Martha asks for in return.
No, their relationship is a bit unbalanced, but Martha must get something out of it. The other time that she gets a call out from Martha is around Cross, where Martha says something like, you should just talk to him, right? And Lee is kind of saying some version of like, I'm just going to pick up scraps, like I'll take whatever I can take and whatever he wants, I'll give him, and not like, I'm going to ask to be in a real relationship or I'm going to ask where this is going. And Martha's like, why not?
Right.
Just ask.
Martha is so normal and wise and able to kind of see through everything that Lee is thinking and just be like, just talk to him. I can't imagine the frustration of kind of being the Martha in that relationship. But yeah, she must be getting something in return and, you know, genuinely enjoys Lee's company. I mean, we see when she and Martha kind of first meet and they click, they hit it off. And that's when they're with, I think it's Conchita that they're with at that time. And they just kind of form this instant friendship. So
she has lots of incisive observations. So she might be like funny to hang out with.
Yeah. And we do see her kind of one-on-one acting pretty differently in conversations than she does with like a larger group of people, or when she feels kind of the safety of belonging, right? When she knows that Martha is like kind of there for the long haul and not going to leave her, she does seem to kind of inhabit this different sense of self than she does when she feels like she has something to prove.
What do you think Martha gets out of their friendship?
I mean, I think that female friendship in high school is such a kind of wild thing and is pretty different than female friendship as an adult. Or maybe that's just me, but I do think being best friends as teenage girls can be so all-encompassing. It can be such a passionate friendship that can really hinge on inside jokes and slumber parties and things that like maybe wouldn't be a solid friendship as adults. But it does seem like they click right away. They make little jokes with each other. They hit it off. And that seems to be enough to kind of sustain them. And it's nice to think that there's someone like Martha who can really see through so much of the like turbulence in Lee's head and still kind of see like, oh, you're funny. You're a good person. You're doing your best. You're like fun to be around, even if you're kind of weird in big social situations, you know? I feel like that's the dream as an anxious person, for someone to kind of see through all that and just be like, oh, you're cool. I enjoy spending time with you.
Are you on Martha's side when it comes to why Lee cuts hair? Do you buy that explanation, or why do you think she cuts hair?
I do agree with Martha, but I don't think that Lee knows that at the time. It's a reason for people to learn her name. The very first guy, I think his name was Tullis with the long hair that she cuts for the first time. And there's so many little moments in that where she's like, I'm so close to his head right now. Like, I'm staring at his scalp. I have this like really intimate view of a person that like other girls would die for. And it seems like she maybe doesn't realize that that's not the same thing as like knowing somebody, right? Like it's not.
Yeah, it's a transactional.
Yeah, but for her it does seem to be like, oh, I've cut this person's hair. Everyone's going to notice his haircut and ask, and he's going to say that it was me. It gives her like this very small amount of social capital and like intimacy with other people that I don't know that she consciously realizes that that's what she's doing. But it does seem like she kind of counts on things like that to interact with other people. It's like she needs a reason.
There's so much in this text because looking again at this phrase that Martha says, people are too busy thinking about themselves. And that's not entirely true because Martha's thinking about her.
Yeah.
One person has broken through.
And from a place of care and actual intimacy and not a place of, judgment or condescension or anything like that, which I think is what Lee imagines people are thinking.
They weren't thrown together. They're choosing to be together.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't put in some kind of artificial situation. They made friends for real. So she can do that.
Yeah, it's almost the only place that we see Lee have any agency and make a choice. Which again is so interesting because she's the one who wants to end up at this school. She didn't end up there by accident. It took a lot of agency and a lot of dedication to end up at the school. And then she really lets almost everything just wash over her. One of the only choices we see her really making is to room with Martha.
And then they stay friends, which is so sweet. This friendship is so powerful. I had thought that this was a YA book, and I had so egregiously misinterpreted the haircut arc.
Oh, interesting.
I've been reading a lot of books that are aimed at younger readers because that's a lot of books that people have nostalgia for. And in books that are aimed at kids or younger people, they will have a protagonist discover a skill or talent. And then that becomes part of their identity. I thought that she was going to become a beauty entrepreneur.
Yeah. I mean, there's a moment where it feels like, and I think she feels too, like, oh, I found my place. I figured out what I can do. Like, I found my role in this ecosystem. I found something I'm good at. There's the kind of weird moment where her teacher has her cut her hair for like a grade.
What is that about?
Yeah, a whole other thing. Really bizarre kind of moment. And again, another person who really doesn't belong there. And yet Lee, instead of seeing her as like a common, oh, we both don't belong here, I can help you, or I can, solidarity. Instead, she sees her kind of as like an enemy. She's like, oh, gross, like cringy to watch another person not belong. There's a whole lot there too. But yeah, it's almost like Lee falls into this moment where she finds her talent and her place. And then, that's not how it goes.
And there also is, that's not a script for your life that people at alt would see as legitimate. I want to do a short sidebar on the teacher because there's this young English teacher who butts heads with Lee, and then she writes something kind of inappropriate in an assignment. She's going to flunk the assignment, and then she cuts the teacher's hair. Every way that she's described is with total scorn and disgust.
Yes.
But I felt so warm toward, I believe it's Ms. Mori. She's just a girl. We learn later that she's 22.
It's her first teaching job ever. We learn that she's also from the Midwest.
She has an accent.
Yeah, she actually has a lot in common with Lee coming to this school to teach as a newcomer. Lee mentions, I just reread this part because everyone's really zeroing in on her clothes. She's wearing this like long denim skirt, and Lee is like, that's so Midwestern, like no one here would wear that. And so she's zeroing in right away on each of the individual things that make her like not quite fit in there. There's a part where the teacher says not to toot my own horn, and the whole class kind of like cringes because they're like, it's so, you don't do that. You wouldn't brag about yourself. And also you would never call attention to the fact that you're bragging about yourself. Like there's these tiny conventions that a brand new teacher from the Midwest couldn't possibly know, but are kind of like outing herself as not belonging there. But you see her trying so hard. She's trying to be like the cool young English teacher. She's trying to get through to the students. There's some weird moments that happen in class, and then it's her idea for Lee to cut her hair for a grade. She's the one who says, "I'll tell you what, you cut my hair and I'll grade you on the haircut." Which feels like something maybe an experienced teacher there would not do. There's such a line crossing there of intimacy, just a teacher being in the dorms at all. It feels odd. The whole thing feels pretty odd.
I do think it was an attempt to tell Lee that she belongs, that she has a role at the school, that this is her specialty.
But I think coming from this teacher who also so clearly doesn't belong,
it's inappropriate. It comes from a good place, but it's so inappropriate.
And I think it highlights, like you said, it wouldn't be a valid path for a student at all to follow that, to say this is your thing. And so it just highlights even more that this teacher also doesn't understand the kind of conventions and dynamics there for her to try to solidify, like, yes, you found your thing. You're good at this. Who cares about your paper? I'll give you an A on a haircut, because that's just not done there.
That's the Iowa coming out in her, right? She's been like, I'm going to help this child follow her dreams to be a hairdresser, not realizing that this is not what's happening in this social context.
And it's so interesting for Lee, instead of recognizing like, hey, we are both coming from really different places, like, I see the Midwest in you, and like feeling any sort of sympathy or solidarity with this brand new teacher. It's just scorn. It's just contempt. And I wonder if Lee thinks that that's how other people are seeing her, right? With the same amount of contempt and scorn. And it's really not.
No, I think Lee is displacing some of the negative feelings she has about herself and the most Midwestern, unfixably Midwestern and other parts of herself, that she sees that in the teacher.
And is disgusted by that.
Well, we're nearing the end of our time together. It's time for our closing questions. And the first one is past life homework. Thinking back to 14-year-old Courtney, maybe 15, if you could assign a book or any document from any time period to time travel, give that kid something to read, what would you like to put in her hand?
I'm going to give you a cop-out answer and a real answer. So my cop-out answer is that I think that Prep was actually the perfect book for me to read at the time. It's hard to think of something better, and I couldn't have possibly read it then with the brain that I have now. There's so much I missed and so many lessons I took from it that were like not really the right lessons to have taken. But I think it was such an important book for me to read at that age. I think it was the perfect book, and I read it at the perfect age. So a cop-out answer, but I would give her Prep to read for sure. And the real answer, I think it was so important for me to be reading more adult books at the time, having thought that Prep was young adult at the time and now realizing that it wasn't. I would give 14 or 15-year-old Courtney more adult books. I would give her Memoir, an essay collection that was like just way beyond, things that would have shocked her. And the book I keep coming back to, which is not meant for 15-year-olds, but which has been really foundational in my life, is Leslie Jamison's The Empathy Exams. There's so much there that would have shocked me as a 15-year-old and that I wouldn't have, read well or read correctly at the time. I would have given teenage Courtney some Leslie Jamison nonfiction to dive into.
Awesome. It sounds like that influenced your later writing in a big way.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Finally, not everything can be a classic. Even books we really love, we always have to make choices. Not everything can stay on the shelf. Some things, after a period of time, go down the library stairs. They go into the archive, into the stacks, because we have to make room for new things. And we are now 20 years in to Prep. It's just about getting to that phase where it may get weeded from libraries, may not be in print that much longer, may not be offered at bookshops. Where do you land on this? Library or archive? Shelf or stacks?
I'm going to say shelf. I think a lot of the book holds up. I think there are definitely some problematic moments with some of the students of other races. And I think there's really interesting conversation out there about it. There are moments where you can really see where things have aged.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it holds up. I think so much of the discussion around class is still relevant. I think anything about that level of teenage anxiety and high school anxiety is kind of timeless. I mean, imagine the book if they had all had iPhones at the same time, would be a very different story. The way that has now changed teenage mental health. I think a lot of high school stories and very anxious teenage protagonists stand the test of time. And just in general, it's such a rich text. I mean, we could talk for so many hours about some of the plots and subplots in this book. And I'm happy to say that just recently I actually saw it on an end cap at a bookstore. So I know it's still out there, and I'm glad people are still picking it up for the first time.
That's awesome. Wow, thank you so much for that. And thank you for spending this time together. And I would like to give you a minute to talk about your work, your book, and why people might want to read it. As I've already said, one of my favorites of the year, an incredible memoir of belonging. There's great stories in there about going through relationships, about going through illness, and about cats and what cats can teach us about people. But I would like to give you a chance to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you for all your kind words about it. My book is Poet Square, a memoir in 30 cats. It came out this year in April, and it has been really exciting to see the reader response to the book. It stemmed from initially my social media accounts, which were about moving into a house that had 30 cats living outside and kind of accidentally becoming involved in the world of animal welfare, realizing that I liked it and was good at it and just kind of kept doing it, and all of the ways that has changed my life since. It is very much a book about cats. There's a lot of cats in it, but I'm really glad to see readers picking up on so many of the other themes happening in it. I definitely didn't set out to write a book about belonging or anxiety, but like you pointed out, and as so many other people have pointed out, there really is so much in it about relationships and growing up, coming of age, illness and school, and moving across the country. There's a good amount of stuff about capitalism and systems we're living under that are not serving us well, and how we survive under all of that. And ultimately, it's about community and care through the lens of cat rescue and working with cats in the community and how we all take care of each other.
Well, thank you so much, Courtney. I encourage everybody to pick up the book. It's so, so special. And it was such a huge treat for me and for my listeners to get the chance to talk to you a little bit more about a book that was influential on your journey. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely, and always love a chance to revisit a book from the past. Really special.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Courtney. This was incredible. I cannot wait for people to hear it.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Pages Past is a production of Yikes Media. It's hosted by me, Genna Buck, and produced by Caleb Buys. Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you so much for listening. Keep up with the show at pagespastcast.com or on Instagram at pagespastcast. Get early updates and free extras by joining the free Patreon at patreon.com/pagespast. That's PAST. You can also become a paying patron. Through Patreon, this project is funded and made possible by listeners like you. Thank you. Special thanks to Hillary, Alex, Robin, Sam N, Sam E, Mike Schubert, and everyone at the Stony Brook University Podcast Incubator. Questions and responses on this program are edited significantly for length and clarity. I make every effort to represent conversations faithfully. Training any automated program on this content is prohibited by the copyright holders. Until next time, I hope all your library holds come in early, and happy reading.